Hello and welcome back to Faith Evolving. Today we're going to be talking about metaphorical arson through the question, should we burn Babylon down? So I was first introduced to the phrase, burn Babylon down, in the King's Kaleidoscope song, which was released October 30th, 2020, entitled, What Do You Know About Grace? But in its acronym form. And that song fills me with such a holy indignation, a righteous anger, and I love it. It calls out true hypocrisy in our idol-ridden, graceless perversion of Christianity, with zingers like, sold your white Jesus to prop the empire up, you made the message a weapon, and don't test the Jesus you lean on. And that's just to name a few. The whole song is filled with scorchers. Pun intended. I'm having way too much fun with this lighter. I should not have been able to buy this. I put the link to the song in the description so you too can march around your home with a crazed look in your eyes and alarm your roommates. I'm a joy to live with. But the widespread use of the phrase burn Babylon down actually has its roots in Rastafarianism, which I will now try to explain with an abundance of caution so I don't sound like Ross Trent.
Chant down Babylon, midterm essays, then puff from the chalice I make from a Sprite can. Last week I read a book about Selassie, then told my Boba Clot parents I was switching religions.
So Rastafarianism is an Abrahamic religion, meaning that it has its origins in the narrative of Abraham and his sons, Ishmael's lineage being that of Islam, and Isaac's lineage being that of Judaism, Christianity, and Rastafarianism. And Rastafarianism most closely resembles Christianity. It was developed in Jamaica and other areas of the Caribbean in the 1930s, and it looks at scripture through the lens of the African diaspora. In Rastafarianism, the name for God is Jah, and the Ethiopian emperor Haile Selassie is viewed as the second coming of Jesus. And Zion, or the Promised Land, is Africa. Rastafarianism is also very much so tied to reggae, and especially the music of Bob Marley. Now, I love Bob Marley. I've been listening to Bob Marley ever since I was a child, which is very interesting considering that my parents were pretty strict about what we could listen to. So I'd be like riding my bike around my neighborhood listening to I Shot the Sheriff, sandwiched between Big House by Audio Adrenaline and something from the Cat soundtrack. So if you're upset with me for making this video, take it up with my parents. They planted a seed and they did not kill it before it grew. Anywho, in his music, he often mentions Babylon. And Babylon is seen as kind of an umbrella term for any oppressive structure or institution or government. And burn down Babylon is a common lyric. But what actually was Babylon? Historically, it was one of the city-states found in the ancient Mesopotamia civilization located in the Fertile Crescent.
What? We in that Fertile Crescent.
That song transports me back to 7th grade social studies class. It was third block, right after lunch, and the Mesopotamia civilization had a vibrant culture, it had literature.
With that old book, Epic of Gilgamesh.
They wrote things down in
cuneiform,
which is our earliest recording of decipherable writing that we have, which is really interesting. They also had foundational concepts of mathematics and medicine. They were also really big on astronomy and actually originated the practice of astrology. However, in Mesopotamia, all of the city-states were often vying for power, and Babylon had two periods where it was top dog. First was when Hammurabi was in charge.
Hammurabi's code matches tooth for tooth. Poke an eye out and get yours poked out too.
And the second time, many centuries later, with Nebuchadnezzar.
Nobody rule better. I'm Nebuchadnezzar. Me and my Chaldeans are sharper than cheddar.
And he's mentioned in the Bible a lot. In history, he's cited as a cruel conqueror, and we definitely see that in the recordings in the Bible. Under his reign, the temple is destroyed, the Israelites are exiled. He was also this guy in VeggieTales.
I won't go to church, and I won't go to school. That stuff is for sissies, but bunnies are cool.
Except instead of Shadrach and Benny, it was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And Nebuchadnezzar, instead of being like, hey, sing this song about only eating candy and nothing else of substance, was actually not bowing down to a giant chocolate bunny, but a giant golden statue of himself. So it's a little different. But as the story goes, our trio refuses and is thrown into a fire. But they survive, and Nebuchadnezzar's like, oh my gosh, who's your god? He was also a key player in this episode of VeggieTales.
Daniel, because you violated Section 4219 2R9 4006.1-7B of the Code of Babylon forbidding prayer to anyone but King Darius, you are hereby sentenced to be consumed by the lions. Goodbye.
Hey, don't I get a phone call?
Daniel's interactions with Nebuchadnezzar and interpreting his dreams and God's connection with Nebuchadnezzar kind of paints more of a holistic view of him as a character. But even in the story of Daniel in the lion's den, Babylon as a whole represents this legalism and corruption and all around distance from the God of the Bible's narratives. But looking at Babylon as representative of all empire, the Bible has a lot to say on that through the prophets. And prophets were people who had an encounter with God and made a commitment to speak God's truth to everyone, and they usually were not liked because the truth wasn't that great. And that truth was reminding them of the covenant or the relationship commitment to God that the Israelites had made. So they called for repentance and warned of consequences when everybody didn't live up to their end of the bargain. But the meat of their message was to bring justice to or from oppressive, violent nations. And at certain points, this was good news for the Israelites, and other points, it was bad news for the Israelites, and that had to do with whether they were the ones oppressing at that current moment in time, or if they were the ones being oppressed. The prophets wrote resistance literature, and most of it was pretty grim, but then they'd have these pockets of hope that are beautiful. And my most favorite is one from Amos. Not famous Amos, not the Amos from Chicago. This guy. But let justice roll down like waters and righteousness an ever-flowing stream. And it's beautiful, and I love it. And if my grandma wouldn't disown me, I would probably get it tattooed on my body. But this resistance literature, I think, is so rich and full of messages that are important to us today. Well, at this point, you're probably wondering, why is this relevant? That was a long time ago. But I raise you this, looking at America as Babylon, or empire. So empire is where we get the word imperialism, which is extending power through diplomacy or force. And America was born out of the British Empire.
It's a big world and it's ours to have. We'll even take it from you cause we want it that bad. India, Africa, we won't get tired cause the sun never sets on the British Empire.
That's right, I put more vocabulary in this. I am the daughter of teachers. So we inherited this mindset of empire as seen through the furthering of acquiring states post the Revolutionary War. I mean, we got 37 more of them. And in the process, displacing the indigenous tribes, including the Erie, Kickapoo, and Shawnee, which are all native to my home state of Ohio. We also forced the native people living here into exile through the Trail of Tears and even still with reservations. Next, we have the first big age of American imperialism, which I learned from John Green in Crash Course History.
Why rent when you can conquer?
Which takes place in the late 19th and early 20th century, which is also the same time that we started pledging allegiance to the flag. So, kind of got this uptick in nationalism. So that's something to consider. And we wanted more resources to trade and compete with the other imperial powers on the scene. And around this time is when we annexed what would become states, Alaska and Hawaii, and started screwing over their indigenous people. And also the Spanish-American War, remember the May, when we annexed Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam, which still aren't states, and we're doing them dirty, and it's kind of unconstitutional, I learned in the John Green video, so that's something also. And then you could argue that there was a second age of imperialism through the Cold War, with this idea of spreading democracy to fight the USSR. And we still kind of do the same thing in the Middle East. We claim it's a war on terror, but the only reason that the war on terror was able to happen was because we wanted their oil. So America's textbook empire, we're technically an indirect empire because we aren't as hands-on, but we're still screwing people over. And in biblical times, probably would have some prophets being pissed. So now we're back to burning Babylon down. And if America is Babylon, should we burn America down? The most compelling argument against this that I've heard is from Ali B. Stuckey, host of the podcast Relatable. I often very much so disagree with her, but I like watching her content from time to time because it helps me understand why I disagree and also understand the cause and effect and the line of thinking amongst the religious right. And in her podcast that was released the day after January 6th, 2021, she discusses what happened at the Capitol, but what the compelling argument was regards hypocrisy. She brings attention to the fact that a lot of the rioters perceived personal disenfranchisement and felt like their only option was violence. And there is a parallel to draw here to systemically and historically oppressed people in America, especially Black people, which Ali herself identifies. But she says,
everyone should have been condemning the violence that has gone on in this country since May in a way that we have not seen in a very long time. Either be consistent in this or be quiet in this.
And I'll be honest with y'all, I really struggle with this. And author, poet, all-around prolific person, James Baldwin, has this quote that says,
to be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a state of rage almost all of the time.
And I will never experience that specific rage or that specific level of very understandable rage because I will never experience racism. Therefore, I have no jurisdiction to police it because I am part of what caused that rage. It is for this reason that Stuckey's comparison is a faulty one. The anger of a people who have been stolen, killed, beaten, enslaved, and sexually violated for having more pigment, and having their neighborhoods systematically destroyed and systemically blocked from advancement, with centuries of a lack of accountability for the people who did these things, is much different than the anger of people who falsely believed an election was stolen, despite mounting evidence it was not. It's the difference between being angry that you've been cheated on versus getting angry that you got caught. I can condemn what happened at the Capitol because I see myself in those people. Because white supremacy dehumanizes all of us. And the way that it dehumanizes the people who have the power is that we turn into monsters in order to maintain that power when we feel as if it's slipping away. Stuckey also has these series of tweets about the phrase, riots are the voice of the unheard. And she takes considerable issue with it. But I'd like to reframe it. And I'm sure I'm not the first person to reframe it, but I'm going to talk about it and correct me if I'm wrong in doing this. But what if riots are the voice of the unheard isn't a call for violence, but a message telling us to look at what caused such an anger to lead to riots and to treat that problem instead of focusing our efforts on placating the symptoms. Because that is the drug of empire. I'll be honest, the phrase burn Babylon down gets me revved up until it switches to burn America down because I have a lot of stake in empire. There are areas where it screws me over, but overwhelmingly, it kind of treats me pretty good. That neighborhood I told you I was riding my bike around in has a literal picket fence around it and a street name with the word plantation in it. So what is the argument for burning Babylon down? Bringing justice. And it's a pretty big one because the God of the Bible is a God of justice. We see it in the prophets and we see it in Jesus. Their message is not good for people in power. But you know who it is good for? The casualties of American exceptionalism. So I guess the question then turns to, how do we burn Babylon down? Especially, how do we burn Babylon down when we're living in Babylon? Well, I'll tell you an example. Whatever the heck happened with GameStop.
I've been getting dirty money, Jordan Belfort.
Okay, spot the difference between that video of me when the green screen did me dirty and this picture from Anne of Green Gables. You can't. But I digress. I'll let Hank Green explain this time. What happened with the GameStop stock and why it is so significant.
The important thing here is that this instability was not created by Reddit. It was created by hedge funds who promised to buy more stock than existed. There are some real terrible arcane systems for manipulating our world for the benefit of like the worst people. These manipulating agencies should be regulated out of existence. They shouldn't be able to do what they do. But instead, At least in this one way, they got memed out of existence. That door has been slammed in their face by a few hundred people who figured something out, and a few million people who were mobilized in a financial action unlike any one has ever seen ever in the world. Eventually, people are gonna figure out how powerful they are. It'll be interesting to see what we do with that.
That's our form of civil disobedience. Drawing attention to the problems and collectively getting together and doing something about it. It's knowing that we are more powerful when we're banded together. And I personally prefer it this way because a violent revolution would be a lot less like the Revolutionary War and a lot more like the French Revolution. And I love Les Mis, but I would prefer not to die in a pile of rubble as I'm singing a song to my unrequited love. It's just, I just don't want to do it, but I guess I'll do it if I have to. But that's it for the metaphorical arson today. Like if you want this video to reach more people, subscribe if you want to see more, leave a comment down below if you think we should burn Babylon down, or if you have any suggestions on how we burn Babylon down. Bye.
Burn Wall Street! Burn! Burn! Burn Wall Street! When the revolution comes, where will you hide?